I hadn't been back to my hometown in years, not since I learned how distance can disguise itself as freedom. Yet here I was again, in a black dress that didn't fit the shape of my shoulders anymore, carrying a suitcase heavy with clothes and the weight of unfinished conversations. My father's funeral had been short, polite, and strangely efficient, like an errand completed. People offered condolences like they were passing out receipts, and then they disappeared into the drizzle. The house smelled exactly as I remembered, faint wood polish, paper, and the ghost of my father's aftershave. But the warmth had drained from the rooms. Dust stood where once there were conversations. Every photograph on the walls looked like a question I hadn't answered. I moved from room to room as if tracing an old wound with a fingertip. In the study, I found the desk locked, its drawers silent. In the corner stood a small steel safe. He had always been protective of it. Even as a child, I knew not to touch it. Now the key sat in a brown envelope labeled only with my name. I hesitated before opening it. The house creaked softly, the rain thickened outside, and I felt as if every sound was listening. Finally, I crouched in front of the safe and turned the key. The mechanism clicked in a slow, deliberate way, like a heartbeat. Inside lay a stack of folders, a few old passports, and one large envelope sealed with brittle tape. My name again. My father's handwriting looked heavier, shakier than it had ever been. I carried the envelope to the kitchen table and sat in the chair where he used to read the newspaper. My hands trembled as I peeled the tape back. Photographs slid out like silent confessions. My mother stood in each frame, younger, her hair longer, her smile aimed at someone off camera. In several photos she was with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, dark hair, an intensity in his gaze even in stillness. And in more than one picture, a little girl clung to her side. The girl's eyes mirrored mine. On the back of one photo in my father's hand were 3 words. John, summer 1996. A strange weight settled behind my ribs. I flipped through the rest, each image a small rupture in the story I'd been told. My father's absence became a different kind of presence, a whisper urging me to keep looking, to stop pretending. Outside, the rain turned to sleet. Inside, under the kitchen light, my life began to split into before and after. I didn't sleep that night. The house groaned in the cold, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photographs again. My mother's hand resting lightly on John's shoulder. The little girl who looked like me wearing a dress I remembered owning, but in a place I'd never been. By morning, I was pacing the kitchen tiles, trying to match fragments of memory with the faces in the pictures. My father's note had been brief, but it echoed louder than any will or testament. John, summer 1996. Nothing else. No explanation, no comfort, just a name and a date. I searched the rest of the safe and found a bank book, brittle and yellowed at the edges. Transactions I didn't understand ran across the pages like coded messages. Money leaving one account, entering another. The last entry had been 2 months before his death. I called my aunt to ask about John, but her voice tightened. I don't know anyone by that name, she said too quickly, then changed the subject to weather and church repairs. The air between us became a locked door. In the afternoon, I drove to the local library and combed through old newspapers. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. Maybe a photograph, maybe a headline, but I felt certain the past had left breadcrumbs. Hours passed, light shifted on the microfilm screen, and finally a name surfaced. John M. Harrington, listed as a rising entrepreneur, photographed at a fundraiser in the late 90s. The same eyes as in the photos. I wrote the address down, my hand trembling. My father had known. My mother had smiled for cameras while hiding a life inside another life. And somehow, I had been at the center without even knowing it. Driving back to the house at dusk, I felt the road narrow, the trees lean closer, the town itself folding in like a fist. My mind replayed childhood moments, the way my father would sometimes watch me when he thought I wasn't looking, his questions about my friends, his sudden silences when my mother's name came up. At home, I spread the photographs across the table like tarot cards, trying to read the pattern. The little girl stared back at me from every angle. Same eyes, same tilt of the head, same faint scar on the chin. I touched the photo as if it could confirm something through my fingertips. Night came early. The house smelled of dust and rain. I locked the door and set the envelope back in the safe, but the knowledge stayed in me, restless. The name John pulsed like a drumbeat behind my eyelids. I knew this was only the beginning, and that whatever truth waited at the end would not leave me untouched. Morning arrived the way truth does. Without asking permission, I brewed coffee that tasted like ash and opened the bank book again, tracing the columns as if my finger could translate them. The numbers arranged themselves into a pattern. Regular transfers that began the year I started grade school and continued through college, tuition-sized bites taken from an account I'd never heard of. Whoever John was, he had been a current running beneath my life, invisible and constant. I walked the neighborhood in a slow circuit, collecting details that used to be background. Mrs. Klein across the street watered her geraniums the way she had when I was 12. She glanced at me with a kind of sympathy reserved for people who don't yet know the worst of it. I asked about my mother's old friends. Names surfaced, some I remembered, most I didn't. When I mentioned John, her watering can tilted. She recovered too quickly, wished me peace, and retreated behind her door. Another lock sliding shut. At the library, I requested more reels of old newsprint. The fluorescent lights hummed like insects. On the screen, time unspooled in columns. Fairs, fundraisers, weddings. Small civic declarations that people make when they want to be seen. John Harrington appeared again in a business profile. A startup that almost failed, then didn't. A photograph where he stood a fraction behind my mother, the frame pretending they didn't know each other. The caption gave an address for an old office and the name of a foundation that sponsored scholarships. I checked the foundation's filings. Public, tidy, unemotional. There it was. A scholarship granted to a teenage girl from our town the year I turned 16. The description was bland. A paragraph about opportunity and potential. No names, just a case number. The blandness felt deliberate, like snow packed over footprints. I carried copies to the car and stared through the windshield until the glass fogged. The puzzle gathered its edges. My father had known. He had chosen silence, perhaps to keep the roof steady, perhaps because love sometimes looks like pretending. The realization wasn't an accusation. It was a gravity shift. Everything in the house settled in a new place. Back home, I opened the safe again, slower this time. At the very bottom, beneath the folders, lay a smaller envelope I hadn't noticed, thin as a breath. Inside, a key stamped with a storage facility's logo and a receipt dated 2 months earlier. He had left me a door and waited for me to find it. The storage site sat on the edge of town where warehouses keep their secrets. A clerk signed me in with board efficiency, then pointed down a corridor that smelled of dust and coolant. In Unit 14, a single banker's box waited on a metal shelf. Inside were letters in my mother's handwriting, unsent drafts, confessions never mailed. She wrote about a man she couldn't stop thinking about. She wrote about a child who looked like him. She wrote about the day my father said he would raise me as his own, and how that promise saved her from drowning and taught her to hold her breath. I read until the air tasted metallic. The letters didn't give me a verdict. They gave me weather, storms, brief clearings, fog. But at the bottom of the box lay one last note in my father's hand, 3 lines only. If you go looking, don't go alone. Truth has a long shadow. He had underlined long twice. I folded the note and put it in my pocket like a talisman. The shadow was already stretching toward me, and I was done pretending it was shade. The city where John lived rose from the highway in clean plains of glass, a place that polished itself every morning. I drove there with the photographs in a folder and my father's note in my wallet, the radio off, the road unspooling like a dare. I had no appointment, no plan worthy of the word, only an address gleaned from public records and the kind of resolve that forms when the ground behind you has crumbled. His office tower wore a lobby of marble and mild music. People moved like they knew exactly where they belonged. I didn't. I sat on a leather chair near a fountain and watched the elevators consume and release strangers. Names flickered on a directory. Harrington Capital floated 4 lines from the top, as if truth could be listed alphabetically. I timed the rhythm of the elevators and studied the security desk. The guards maintained the particular attention of people who have been bored long enough to notice everything. I didn't try to bluff my way past them. Instead, I traced circles through the surrounding blocks. Coffee shop, florist, a dry cleaner that displayed photographs of local charity galas. John appeared in 2 of them, his smile technical. His hand resting on the shoulder of a woman who wasn't my mother. The caption called him a benefactor. The word pressed against my ribs until it hurt. I took a table by the window and opened my folder, pretending to read. In the glass I could see both the street and my own face. A composite of 2 stories finally colliding. I wrote down questions, not to ask him but to steady myself. Why the transfers? Why the scholarship? Why the silence? The list grew, then pared itself down to the only question that mattered. Who gets to define me? Mid-afternoon, the lobby doors parted and he stepped out of a black car. Older now, but the architecture of his face unchanged from the photographs. The crowd moved around him like water around a stone. He walked with the unstudied assurance of someone used to arriving. I felt the impulse to stand and call his name, to watch recognition rearrange his features, but I stayed seated, letting the moment pass like a test I wasn't ready to take. Following him would be easy. Confronting him would be easy to imagine and impossibly hard to control. Instead, I wrote the time in my notebook and watched the building swallow him. I needed a margin, a buffer of strategy between instinct and impact. Truth might be a door, but I wanted the right key. On the way back to my car, I circled to the service alley where deliveries came and went. A bulletin board near the loading dock listed vendor contacts and event schedules. At the bottom, pinned crookedly, was a notice for the Foundation's annual scholarship dinner. 3 weeks away, black tie, open to past recipients by invitation. The email address for RSVP sat beside a phone number that belonged to a coordinator whose social media took exactly 1 search to find. I stood in the alley with trucks idling and wrote an email from the address I rarely used. I didn't lie. I introduced myself as Bree, a former resident of his hometown researching the Foundation's impact. I asked for a seat at a table in the back. No special attention, just space. Words can be keys too when they are arranged with care. By sunset, the city had turned reflective, windows catching sky like water. I drove out with a folder on the passenger seat and the event date circled in my calendar. The urge to knock on his office door tightened and then loosened, like a muscle learning restraint. There would be a moment for collisions. This wasn't it. Back on the highway, the horizon thinned into a pink seam. I thought of my father's note about long shadows and realized something new. A long shadow means there is a light source, steady and present, somewhere behind you. I didn't need John to provide it. I could bring my own step by step, until even the tallest shadow ran out of places to hide. The reply arrived before midnight. A polite confirmation that my seat at the Foundation dinner was secured, dress code attached, doors at 7. The email's tone was efficient, almost tender in its impersonality. I read it twice, then closed the laptop and stood in the quiet house that had begun to sound like a shell at low tide. My father's note rode in my pocket like a heartbeat. Truth has a long shadow. Preparation became a ritual. I scanned public filings until numbers blurred into static, marked names on a list. Board members, longtime donors, protégés who owed their starts to John's money. The scholarship brochure was glossy and color-safe. It told a neat story about opportunity. Between the lines, the old bank book sat like a cough someone kept swallowing. I visited the storage unit again. The cold there was a different breed, metallic, patient. I read the unsent letters until I could almost hear my mother's hand pause over ink. Love, guilt, vows, detours. Her paragraphs moved like weather reports from a storm she never named. At the bottom of the box I found a single Polaroid I had missed. My father and John on opposite edges of a frame, a fundraiser banner drooping behind them. Their eyes didn't meet. 2 architects of my life standing in the same room pretending the walls were load-bearing. At home I practiced walking into a room I did not belong to. I practiced silence that did not equal surrender. I slid the photographs into a slim folder, then removed them. I could carry their weight without showing them yet. I wrote a single sentence on a note card and tucked it in my clutch. I decide what this means. On the afternoon of the dinner, the town emptied into evening. I dressed like a version of myself that could survive chandeliers and small talk. On my way out the door, I pressed my palm to the safe one last time, a superstitious benediction for secrets and for the person forced to carry them. The drive into the city felt like threading a needle in motion. Every mile shaved off the distance between the story I'd been given and the one I would write in its place. Outside the hotel, valets folded cars into order, and the lobby glowed under a ceiling that wanted to be a sky. I checked my name, accepted a badge, and stepped into a ballroom full of curated generosity. The air smelled like flowers and polished cutlery. My seat waited at a table near a pillar, the sort of place where observers disappear. I sat, steadied my breath, and let the evening open like a curtain I had chosen to pull. The program unfolded into speeches and careful laughter. Photographs of grinning scholars rotated on screens, their futures narrated by people who loved microphones. At my table, donors compared calendars. A woman to my left rhapsodized about mentorship with the fervor of an evangelist. I nodded when required and counted the beats between applause. John arrived late, announced by the way the room recalibrated. He moved through it like a tide, handshakes stacking into a procession. Up close, time had drawn its quiet lines across his face, but purpose still fit him like a tailored suit. He took the stage to talk about ladders and doors, about how a single check could tilt the axis of a life. The crowd admired the polish. I listened for the burr beneath it. He did not see me, not then. My anonymity felt like armor. I studied the slide deck and found a familiar silhouette in the year I graduated high school. Scholarship number 47, a girl from my street, the description generalized into a virtue. I remembered her car full of thrift store dresses, the way she left town as if the road might change its mind. The foundation had been her wind. I refused to let that truth rearrange the rest. Between courses, a coordinator stopped to confirm my name and affiliation. I offered the smallest possible version of myself. Hometown volunteer, personal research, thank you for the seat. Her smile was professional kindness lacquered over curiosity. She moved on, and I let my shoulders drop half an inch. After dessert, the room thinned into pockets of conversation. I circled the perimeter where the flowers were tired and the air cooler, until I reached a display board of archival photographs. Galas across decades, handshakes frozen mid-grip. There was my mother in grayscale, her brightness undimmed even without color. 2 frames over, that same fundraiser banner drooped, and on the edge of the photograph stood my father, his shoulders squared against a decision already made. John occupied the center, a man rehearsed by light. He turned then, as if summoned by the geometry of attention, and his eyes skimmed the room before landing on me the way birds test a branch. For a second I felt the old childish panic that I was somewhere I shouldn't be. Then I remembered the note card in my clutch and let the fear pass through. He held my gaze an instant longer than politeness required. Recognition didn't arrive, but curiosity did. He took a step. A board member intercepted him with a question about endowments. The moment dissolved into the hum. I left before the raffle and the final toast. Outside, the air tasted like rain at a distance. I stood under the hotel awning and realized the dinner had given me nothing I could hold up in court and everything I needed to understand the landscape. He was real, persuasive, practiced. The room believed in his version of the story. I would need a louder truth than photographs and a name in a ledger. On the drive home, my phone vibrated with an unknown number that didn't leave a message. The voicemail icon stayed blank, like a door that had been knocked on and then abandoned. I didn't call back. I let the darkness settle and imagined building a case that could withstand chandeliers. The morning after the dinner, my town looked smaller, not because it had shrunk, but because my eyesight had changed. I waited for coffee to cool and made a new list. Board finances, vendor contracts, the scholarship selection process, any place where generosity might be a mask for leverage. The list steadied me. Action is a bridge over panic. The unknown number called again. This time a text followed. Don't meet him alone. No signature. No elaboration. I stared at the words until they became shapes, then turned the phone face down. Warning or manipulation. Both wore the same coat. I went to the county records office and requested filings so dull they had to be honest. Leases, permits, audited statements. The clerk, who looked like she had outlasted 4 administrations and 1,000 small dramas, rolled her chair to a steel cabinet and returned with boxes that smelled like dust caught in bureaucracy. I read until my eyes felt granular. In year-end notes I found references to discretionary allocations that threaded through shell entities like beads. Perfectly legal, perfectly opaque. At home I spread the pages across the floor. Patterns emerge when you give them space. The transfers in my father's bank book had kiss marks in these statements, round numbers that landed with careful timing. Not theft, not even fraud. Just a private current moving under a public river, the kind of thing that lets a benefactor direct a ladder exactly where he wants it placed. Late afternoon, a car idled outside my house longer than parking required. I watched from behind the curtain as a man in a gray suit pretended to check his phone. He had a haircut you could set a clock by. He left without knocking, but the message arrived anyway. Someone was measuring the doorframes of my life. I drove to the storage unit again, not for paper but for air. In the narrow corridor, sound traveled in long, thin lines. A cough 4 doors down carried like a warning. When I lifted the box, something slid from the bottom, an index card taped to the underside. My father's handwriting again, smaller now, as if he had wanted to hide even from himself. A list of dates and case numbers. Court filings. I entered them into my phone with the reverence of a person copying coordinates that might lead out of a maze. At home, those numbers became stories. Settlements kept tidy and sealed, complaints withdrawn after meetings in conference rooms that smelled of citrus and cold water. Nothing explosive, nothing cinematic. Just a quiet history of pressure applied in places that would never make the news. My father had mapped a shadow. He had underlined long because he knew I would be tempted to hurry. That night I slept for 2 hours and dreamed of corridors that never ended. When I woke, the house was still. Somewhere a refrigerator clicked. Somewhere my pulse counted. I held the note card with my sentence, "I decide what this means," and revised it in my head. I decide what I will do with what it means. The difference felt like a door unlocking from the inside. The second envelope wasn't in the safe. It wasn't in the storage unit or wedged inside a book I'd ignored since high school. It waited behind a picture frame in the hallway, the one with my parents on a pier, late sun making them into silhouettes. The frame hung slightly crooked. Perhaps it always had. Perhaps my new eyes noticed angles that kindness once smoothed over. Behind the cardboard backing lay a thin packet sealed with painter's tape. Inside, photocopies of emails, bank confirmations, and one scanned letter addressed to my aunt. The letter was patient and plain, my father asking her to keep quiet about my mother's past, not for his sake but for mine. He included a check. The amount was not obscene, but it was enough to turn silence into a habit. I sat on the floor and let the discovery settle. Betrayal has grades like sandpaper. This one was a fine grit, sanding the edges of trust until they rounded into something you could shrug past if you tried hard enough. I didn't try. I drove to my aunt's house under a sky that looked like unspooled wool. She opened the door with the startled caution of someone expecting a package and receiving a mirror. Her living room was clean in the places guests see and messy in the corners. I told her I had found the letters. I didn't accuse. I offered the facts like a tray set between us. Shame moved across her face in weather patterns. Gusts, a break in the clouds, then a hard wind. She admitted what the paper already knew. She said she wanted to protect me, that the check had felt like a way to keep peace from fraying. She cried. I sat still and watched the story rearrange itself into a shape we could both survive. On the drive home, I did not feel vindicated. I felt correctly informed. The map expanded. My father's silence, my aunt's complicity, my mother's divided heart, John's curated generosity. None of them alone explained me. And together they still didn't own me. That evening I assembled a packet. The transfers, the sealed settlements, the discretionary allocations, the letter to my aunt. I wrote a cover note in the flat voice of someone who has decided to stop asking for permission. I addressed copies to the Foundation's independent auditor, to a journalist who specialized in philanthropy's blind spots, and to a board member whose public speeches about transparency always made the papers. Evidence is not a confession, but it can invite one. Before sealing the envelopes, I placed the Polaroid on top of the stack in mine. Two men in a frame pretending the frame was enough to hold them. I slid my note card into my purse and set an alarm for dawn. Some truths need daylight to start their engines. I chose a neutral battleground. A cafe with high windows and indifferent music, the kind of place where big conversations disguise themselves as meetings. I sent a simple email to John's assistant requesting 15 minutes, framed as a research follow-up. The reply came swiftly with an available slot that afternoon. The speed felt like confidence. When he arrived, the room shifted by degrees. He wore the same assurance I had watched from across a ballroom. Close, it was quieter, more practiced than natural. I introduced myself without mentioning my father, my mother, my childhood. I laid out the documents with the respect one gives photographs of the dead. He read quickly, then slower. The silence between us gathered weight. I described the pattern without accusation, the way money moved to shape outcomes that later returned as applause. I told him about the sealed cases, the scholarships that nudged the river of talent toward his banks. I did not ask if he was my father. Biology had become the least interesting part of him. He spoke carefully, choosing stones to step on. He said outcomes mattered more than routes. He said every foundation manages discretion to guard dignity. He said the world improves in increments and someone has to place the levers. In his version, power was benevolence with a good accountant. I slid a small recorder onto the table, not to threaten, but to clarify the shape of the moment. He didn't flinch. "You want a confession," he said without saying it. I told him I wanted a record. He pointed at the scholarship slides and asked how many lives they had altered for the better. I agreed that many had. Then I pointed at the sealed cases and asked how much choice those people had when opportunity arrived with terms printed in invisible ink. For a heartbeat he looked tired, as if the suit had grown heavier by ounces each year. Then the moment passed. He folded the papers with the precision of a surgeon and suggested a solution. A private arrangement, an endowment in my name, an acknowledgement without adjectives. It was the kind of offer that solves immediate problems and breeds new ones with better shoes. I told him my terms. A public audit, unsealed settlements where possible, a board restructured with people who didn't owe him favors. He measured me the way a builder measures a wall before deciding whether to knock it down. He asked who else had seen the packet. I let the question hang until it became part of the air and not my problem. When he left, he shook my hand like a man accustomed to closure. Outside, the sky had scrubbed itself clean. I exhaled until my ribs loosened. The recorder felt small and heavy in my purse. A story had chosen its shape. Now it needed witnesses. Things didn't explode. They unfolded. The auditor acknowledged receipt. The journalist asked for sources and corroboration. The board member replied with a sentence that sounded like a weather alert, then requested a call. In the space between those messages, the town looked the same and entirely different. The post office still smelled like paper and old glue. The clerk still stamped envelopes as if time were a thing you could mark. My aunt sent a note that read like a truce. The storage unit closed over its cold corridors. I walked the rooms of my father's house and said goodbye as if I were leaving a long convalescence. I packed the photographs last. I kept the Polaroid where my wallet should hold money. The foundation announced an independent review 3 weeks later, a paragraph that used words like integrity and commitment. A local paper ran a cautious piece about questions raised. No one used my name. I did not need them to. I knew what I had done and what I hadn't. I had not solved philanthropy. I had not toppled a man who had built himself into a marble lobby. I had simply refused to let the shadow decide the length of my life. On my final night in the house, I opened every window and let the air sweep the corners. The lights of passing cars stitched the ceiling with brief, moving seams. I thought about asking for a test, a percentage, a number to confirm what my face already suggested. Then I let the thought go. I did not need a lab report to define the boundaries of my mercy or my spine. At dawn I locked the door and slid the key under the mat for the realtor. The street was pale and new. A bus sighed at the corner, and for a second I was 17 again, planning escapes I didn't yet know how to make. I walked to my car and looked back only once. The house did not shrink. It settled into the size it had always been, big enough to hold a childhood, too small to contain a future. On the highway the horizon widened into a clean underline. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't open yet. I rolled down the window and let the air rush in, loud and uncomplicated. Somewhere behind me, a long shadow thinned in the rising light. Ahead, the road waited without promises. That was fine. I had learned to move without them.